It's back, ladies and gentlemen. Compliance Man has finally returned, and the first episode of this season in Compliance Man, Khasanov-Batirov takes a Euro trip. We explore compliance in the EU from Tim's perspective. I know you'll enjoy this season of Compliance Man. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to a new season of Compliance Man. It's been way too long. Everybody's missed Compliance Man, but he is back with us. So, Tim, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for having me today.
As always, I'm joined by Tim Khasanov-Batirov, a compliance practitioner who focuses on compliance at international markets and has done so for 20 years. He has worked in 7 different countries. He's now an in-house compliance officer in the EU. On top of that, he is the co-founder of the Dutch Compliance Club, and you can connect with Tim on his LinkedIn page, which we will link to in the show notes. In this season of Compliance Man, we entitled it EuroTrip, and we're going to focus on hot topics for Europe from the compliance practitioner point of view. We will have some European experts to discuss specific topics in depth, so our listeners will know how to handle them in the European context. We invite you to participate in our discussions by commenting on each podcast and proposing topics for the EuroTrip season of Compliance Man. As usual, the most active listeners will be invited to join us on a podcast. So, Tim, I have welcomed you. Can you tell our audience, the last time we spoke, you were in Moscow, but you are not there now. Can you tell us a little bit about your current role?
Yeah, after Moscow, I used to work in 2 more jurisdictions, which was Germany. And afterwards, I got a chance to work in Ukraine. However, after the start of the war, there was no big compliance horizons at the country, unfortunately, at that moment. So now I'm glad to greet you, Tom, and all our viewers from the Netherlands.
So, Tim, as our listeners will recall, you have traditionally worked in emerging markets, and you've talked about the challenges you and your compliance brethren and sistren have faced in emerging markets, but now you're in a mature market. Western Europe certainly seen financially mature. Compliance, I think, is also moving in that direction. And so could you tell us maybe your top 5 areas that you have worked in or had issues around from the EU perspective?
Thanks, Tom. You're absolutely correctly pointing out that last time when we discussed, we were talking about emerging markets. Now it's the Western markets, it's the Western Europe. And based on my communication with the Dutch Club compliance members and with the compliance community in the Western Europe, probably we can think of the following countdown or the list of the most important pieces of legislation or compliance areas from the European perspective. Of course, with all disclaimers that this is just a certain level of generalization. That's something what I see from my bubble, what I see talking to my compliance colleagues. But probably we can discuss. Maybe you will agree. Maybe you'll have your own opinion with regard to this top 5. First of all, GDPR compliance, a pretty new piece of legislation. However, I think it's in DNA of the Europeans to pay attention to the data privacy things. And what I've seen in the Europe that people are taking in consideration data privacy issues while not necessarily refer to this piece of legislation as such. So it's just something more like cultural from my perspective. Big attention to data privacy thing. Sanctions, obviously, due to the fact that we have a new era of sanctions in race now. This is the situation with Russia, and on top of that, we have a new guidances from the European regulators, from the UK regulators, from the US regulators on all sanctions related. So obviously, this area is on agenda. Ethics, which is probably can be called new ethics, are very popular in the discussions between compliance practitioners and among business people, because in Europe, as you know, we have a big mixture of people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different countries. So ethics, new ethics, this is something which we probably could mention in our top 5. Anti-corruption. Interestingly, what I have seen in many European jurisdictions, or probably, Tom, you won't be surprised, anti-corruption area is not linked to FCPA. Something that I used to see a lot working in big international corporations outside of Europe, that US FCPA was kind of flagman or the most referred act of legislation when I talk about anti-corruption. In Europe, what I see that people refer to anti-corruption not going into specific pieces of legislation like the US or even their local anti-corruption laws. And of course, ESG, responsible business conduct, everything related to that. We have some countries where we got new regulatory requirements, like, for example, Germany, which says that corporations have to make corporate sustainability due diligence processes. We have countries like the UK, where they have adopted Modern Slavery Act a few years ago. We have the EU proposal on EU directive for corporate sustainability due diligence to be performed by the corporations. So basically ESG and all ESG related, of course, in our top list. Definitely, if an organization is acting in a highly regulated industry like healthcare or, for instance, banking, they have their own industry standards, they have their own regulations, and this is just because of their specifics. Tom, what do you think? Is this top 5 might somehow match the US list of compliance priorities or not?
So, yes, I was intrigued by your list. For the United States, GDPR applies to companies doing business in Europe, which are all internationally focused companies. As you may know, we don't have any national data privacy / data protection law here in the United States. Sanctions, of course, is huge. And as you rightly point out, because of the Russian invasion, I think we're now at the 10th or 11th round of sanctions in both the United States, EU, and the United Kingdom. So that's a continuing challenge. The only thing I might add from the US perspective is sort of anti-money laundering, kleptocracy, oligarchs, the chase for yachts, sort of all of those things are equally part of the overall sanctions. Now, because when I hear sanctions, I think trade sanctions, but anti-money laundering and the chase for oligarchic money is very, very important here in the United States. And so really sort of anti-corruption, export control sanctions, and AML are oftentimes grouped together into one. Most interesting in your list, though, is not ESG, because that, I think, is moving forward on a steady basis, but it's your term of ethics, or if we expand it to business ethics, because the United States Department of Justice about 18 months ago started talking about the key was culture. Are you doing business ethically? It's not following the rules. It's not a rules-based approach. It's what's your company culture? And that, of course, is from the top senior executives all the way through middle management to the individual salesperson on the ground in any country in the world. So I thought, I'd always thought Europe was ahead of the United States, because in training around anti-corruption, Europe talked about values as opposed to rules and regulations, which we tended to talk about in the United States. But now the United States has finally awakened to the culture issue. And I think, as you note, that Europe is seeing that as really the basis of any compliance program going forward. So the ethical business, whatever we might call it, I think is one of the most welcome initiatives, both in the EU and in the United States. So what do you see, Tim?
I agree with you. Tom. And yeah, I also have seen that there is a trend to be more in compliance, not with specific pieces of law as such, because what we see is international business. In many cases, we have international corporations that they have to comply with many regulations. But yeah, the attempt is to do ethical business. In the same time, Tom, there is also an interesting trend which I have seen, that in some countries or in the Europe as such, there are nevertheless regulatory developments with regard to compliance. For example, the Whistleblower Directive, which was adopted by the EU as directive, and then it went like a local legislative acts that some countries have already adopted, some in the process. In the same time, yeah, what I've seen, and I think it also was a very good kick to the companies to find out what exactly is needed on top of what they might think is ethical in terms, for example, of whistleblower lines. For instance, in the Netherlands, I know that the legislative act about that specifies that, for instance, the whistleblower line should be open to external stakeholders as well, while, as I know, in some European companies and in some European countries, that was not a matter of kind of rule of the thumb so far. So yeah, ethical business conduct is something that's prevailing. In the same time, yeah, Europe is trying to tackle legislative, trying to make legislative acts that will also specify the expectations.
Tim, another interesting thing that I see developing, I don't want to say a divergence in the United States and the EU, but it's a difference, and that's around ESG. In the EU, we have ESG that is almost regulatory driven. There are several ESG initiatives around ESG. There's the German Supply Chain Act. There's the UK Modern Slavery Act. While not ESG specific, they certainly touch on critical elements of ESG. As you may know, in the United States, now there's political controversy around ESG. So we have no real government sort of regulatory framework, but what we have is a business framework. So investors are very concerned about this because they see ESG as a business process, which actually makes a business run more efficiently and at the end of the day, more profitably. Banks, private equity funds, other institutional investors, large hedge funds, and even insurance companies are requiring companies to have ESG programs. And I still do legal work where I review contracts in the energy industry, and almost all of them now have an ESG component. So if you want to do work at a chemical plant in the Texas Gulf Coast, they're going to want to know about your ESG program. And that's a business to business approach. That's not a regulatory approach. It's not saying that ESG is some evil that is brought to the United States by Democrats or other evil people. It is really seen as a business initiative and a business process. So I was wondering if from your perspective, do you see that, I don't know, maybe dichotomy is the right word, but certainly from a business approach in the United States to a regulatory approach in the EU, is that consistent with what you're seeing?
Yes, Tom, thank you for this interesting observation. What I have seen in the EU corporate world, so to say, that people also try to tackle ESG challenges. And as you have said, in the US, probably we don't have the very advanced legal framework. The same here as of now. However, people and businesses are really keen to be socially responsible, to take care of environment. For me, it was a bit surprise because it was not like a regulatory requirement, and I'm a compliance driven by rules, maybe an old-fashioned person. And nevertheless, for me, it was a great and very nice surprise to find out that businesses here in Europe, they take ESG very seriously. People as such take these areas very seriously. That for me was also a cultural shock, so to say. People think about that. People think it's important. That's why these areas of compliance in the corporate world, as I know based on my conversation with colleagues, there is no obstacles or resistance that we have faced when we were doing anti-corruption maybe 10 years ago. With ESG, it goes smoothly, maybe because not everyone understands what exactly is meant by that. Maybe just it refers to the good human features of the character and our wish to live in a better world. So I would say that we have the very same trend here that you have noticed with regard to the US.
So, Tim, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but Tim and I are here for you, and I hope you'll join us again for another episode of this season of Compliance Man on the EuroTrip. If you disagree with us or you'd like to share your views on any of these topics, please let us know. We'd be glad to hear from you because Tim and I have strived to have a global conversation on compliance, ethics, or any of the other topics we've touched on. So, Tim, I can't wait to see what we come up with for next time.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for listening and watching us.
Hello, everyone. Tom Fox again. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Compliance Man. I hope you will join Tim and I for the entire season of Compliance Man Takes a Euro Trip. Compliance Man Takes a Euro Trip is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.